recent years. His debut novel, The Ice Harvest, was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and won the California Book Award, among many other awards. The book was made into a major motion picture by the same name, The Ice Harvest, starring John Cusack and Billy Bob Thornton. And among your other works are The Walkaway and Cottonwood. And Scott lives here in St. Louis and joined us in the studio.
Hi.
How you doing?
Welcome.
I'm all right, thanks.
So much to cover with you in just a short amount of time, but start with your unique writing style. How would you describe your style, your genre, if you will, of your novels?
Well, part of my problem commercially has been that I'm all over the map in terms of genre. My first book was a crime novel, The Ice Harvest, and kind of in the noir tradition, film noir. I think of sort of doomed protagonists and people doing stupid things, not necessarily detectives solving crimes. And then I wrote a science fiction novel called Rut, and that threw people off. And I wrote a historical novel that you could almost call a Western. And so nobody knows where to put me on the shelf. But they're all funny and they're all kind of dirty.
Yeah. And that's you have this, I think, in reading it, a style of you're not sugarcoating anything out there with your characters. Your characters
Right.
have real flaws. And
deep flaws,
and they don't get better at the end. They continue to be flawed as the story goes on.
Sometimes they get a little better, but
Where does the inspiration come from? I mean, for these novels that you've written?
a lot of it. I wrote a novel called Rake, which is probably my most exaggerated, weird, over-the-top book. And almost everything in it actually happened, and I just exaggerated. So, sometimes it comes from anecdote. If I tell a story more than 3 times, to friends or family, I start to think of it as maybe something I should write down. Some of it's historical stuff. I wrote a book about a family of serial killers in 1870s Kansas called The Bloody Benders. There's a book called Cottonwood. And that story had been haunting me since I was 5 years old. Because everybody, I grew up in Kansas, and everybody in Kansas talks about the Bloody Benders. And so finally I just sat down and started doing research and wrote a book about it. So it comes from all kinds of different places.
What about characters, though? Do you meet someone and you're like, I want to build a book around this character?
I've only ever done 2. And they were both in my first book, based on real people. Actually, some of the characters in Rake were based on real people. But generally, I just take the worst aspects of myself. Not always the worst aspects, but somebody, I forget who it was, John Updike or somebody said that, it's Kurt Vonnegut, I guess, said that all of the characters are me to a degree. And, you put yourself in all of their shoes and try to identify with all of them as much as you can. But, I based a character on a Wichita gangster, character played by Billy Bob Thornton in the movie, and people were always asking me, is that George? Is that supposed to be George? And I would always say no, until George died, and then I said, yeah, it's George. And I was still, even in his 80s, people were still kind of scared of old George.
Yeah. It's interesting. You have written screenplays, short stories, novels. You've written in different languages. Is it the challenge of doing new things, or is there a little bit of artistic ADD in there?
I think the latter.
Okay.
Partially it's the challenge, though, and partially it's just you got to make a living, and sometimes one thing crops up as a possibility, and you think, all right, I'll write a screenplay, and then sometimes it's somebody asks you to, do you have a book I could turn into something, and that's how Rake happened. I wrote, a French publisher hired me to write a novel, and they said, we don't care what it is as long as it's got crime in it, as long as we can turn it into a TV movie. And so I called this friend of mine, and we had tried 25 years earlier to make a movie in France. This guy was an actor. He's a very famous actor in France. And I said, would you mind if I wrote a novel about that time we tried to make a movie? And instead of instead of a narcissist, I make you a sociopath and a killer. And he said, no, that's fine. Can I play myself in the TV movie? And I said, yeah.
Good. Your most recent project is an anthology. You were the editor. You wrote one story,
Right.
but it's a collection of noir stories set in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And it's called St. Louis Noir.
Right. It's part of a series from Akashic Books. I always pronounce it wrong. Published by Johnny Temple, who is famous for a book whose title I can't say on the air, but it was a fake children's book called, I'll euphemize it, Go the Heck to Sleep. But he's been in business a long time. He's a very good publisher, very smart guy. And he's been doing these city noir books for about 15 years. And he finally got around to St. Louis.
And so this is a collection of stories written about St. Louis, crime novels,
Right.
but also written in large part by St. Louisans themselves.
Right. Everybody in the book had a connection to St. Louis, whether they're from here or whether they live here now. Some really good writers, Paul Marks, Michael Castro, who's our poet laureate. We got some poems from him. My friend Lavelle Wilkins Chin actually produced the first story for the collection. I had read it in a writing workshop, and I said, do you want to elaborate on that a little more and put it in the anthology? And it's a great story about her uncle, about this character's uncle. I think it might be based on a real person, but who falls in love with this woman who's, not really worthy of him, and the kind of the things that happen in the family. It's not really a crime story, except that this woman is a grifter. And that's the thing about noir. It's not always about crime per se, but it's about people. I always say it's about people doing things against their own interests and doing so knowingly. And we had some well-known authors, Laura Benedict, John Lutz, and we had Jedediah Ayers, who's well-known to crime readers. And we had some newcomers. Shaw, a writer named S.L. Coney has a story set in Dogtown, and it was a good group of people.
I think I saw Calvin Wilson in there.
Calvin Wilson of the Post-Dispatch.
Post-Dispatch.
I believe it's his first published work of fiction.
Will readers recognize, kind of pieces of St. Louis, places
sure.
of St. Louis? I mean, it's really based for St. Louisans. They're going to know what's going on.
It's very neighborhood-based. And that's the way they put a map in the front of the thing showing you where the stories are set. And and that was one of the things that I found really interesting. My wife always says that she grew up on the East Coast, and she always says that St. Louis feels like a very eastern city. I mean, it feels like a southern city and a midwestern city in a lot of ways, but I think it could be said that it's the westernmost East Coast city. Friends of mine from Baltimore were just here and talking about how distinctive the neighborhoods are, and that made it easy because I wrote a story that takes place in Sauget, but it also goes out to Chesterfield and Wentzville and Forest Park, and this guy's driving all around town following his brother-in-law, trying to figure out what's going on.
The anthology, the book is called St. Louis Noir. Where can people pick up a copy of that?
I believe all of our local independent bookstores have it. The Book House in Maplewood, Subterranean Books in the Loop, and it's thanks to the owner, Kelly Von Plonsky, that I got the job of editing it, because Johnny Temple was on the phone with her and said, well, I don't have an editor. And she said, get Scott, he'll do it. Left Bank in Central West End, and The Novel Neighbor in Webster Groves, and I think Main Street Books in St. Charles probably has it.
Nice to know there's still quite a few bookstores still
this
around.
This is a great town for independent bookstores. It really is.
Scott Phillips, local author. Pick up a copy of St. Louis Noir at your local bookstore, and I'm sure it's online. Or go back and look at some of his other works. The number one, probably the most popular, being The Ice Harvest.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
It's 8:46. KT